Okay, everybody. So thank you for joining. We are excited to host this next FANG event with our Shanghai chapter. My name is Daniel Gallimberti, chapter chair, along with Jay Boyle. And today we're very excited to host Mark Schaub on a very hot topic of factory relocation in China. So I will introduce Mark. Who is a management partner with King and Wood Mallesons and has been working with their firm and in China for the last 20 plus years. Mark specializes in foreign direct investment, M&A restructuring in China, and he is advised on foreign investment projects in all major sectors in China with a cumulative value exceeding 20 billion US dollars. He's familiar with China issues faced by companies of all sizes and is a trusted advisor to many companies ranging from family-owned businesses to Fortune 500 companies. So for this presentation, feel free to ask any questions directly to Mark. And for those who prefer to drop questions in the chat box, you may also do so. And Jay and I would also be able to pick those up and ask Mark as he moves along. So for this moment, I'll hand it over to Mark. And Mark, please pick it up from here.
Okay, thanks a lot, Daniel. Thanks everybody for attending. So look, I'll get straight down to it. Why is it not? Oh, sorry. So look, I think today we're going to talk a little bit about is there a wave of relocation? Why are businesses moving? Where are they moving to? What are the challenges? And at the end, I'll do a few little case studies of cases that we've recently done. So yeah, so I think, a lot of people are talking about relocation. We haven't seen it as often as people think. Some of the stuff which we're seeing, so, our law firm is a large Chinese law firm. We have about 5,000 people in China. So we've got relatively good coverage. And the two countries where we've seen the most, reshoring or offshoring are, US companies or people who are relying on the US supply chain, or Japanese companies. So the CHIPS Act, as all of you know, it is just another example of perhaps the US trying to distance itself to some degree, at least in technology. And we've seen it also when Trump brought in the tariffs against China, that led to some companies needing to relocate their production or find new suppliers. The Japanese have been much more, because we've got a Japan group and we've also got a Tokyo office. And we've had a wave for the last 3 or 4 years of Japanese companies actually closing down and moving out. So most of my clients are US or European companies. So it's been a little bit different. So what we've seen, this is perhaps the news, what we've seen is Apple's moved stuff to Vietnam and India, but it seems that they also have some issues in the quality in India. And they seem to want to build resilience beyond China, but whether it will be easy, China's also a big market for them. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And then Adidas, Nike, Uniqlo, they've moved some of their production out from China to Vietnam, but that again is similar. We saw it about 10 years ago in textiles, a lot of production moved out of China to say places like Bangladesh. That was not because of geopolitics, that was just about cost of production, environmental standards, etc. So what are we seeing right now? I think if we look at our European clients, a lot of them are talking about diversifying supply chains, but they're not doing very much. They're not able to get the quality and the pricing right. We saw in early January a big client of ours, which is a major, massive German company, which has very large operations in China, but also globally. And what they're thinking is that they may need to build a separate supply for US. So I think what they're thinking is for Europe, the China supply chain is not a big problem, but for the US, there may need to be some regional supply chain done. Now, US clients, it's more interesting. I think the geopolitical situation is affecting them much more. And it was a bit, it was a bit of a surprise to me. And in the case study, I'll perhaps explain it a bit. But, I thought what they would try to do is just set up new factories themselves, or they would find new suppliers. But actually, a number of our American clients, they're trying to joint venture with their Chinese suppliers to set up production in Mexico. And I think one of the reasons is it's not that easy to dismantle the supply chain relationship, because very often the Chinese supplier is very key to the whole supply chain. They might have the tooling, they might have the molds, and just cutting them off, it's too risky to the ongoing business. So we've got one client in particular who's setting up their own small industrial park in Mexico, and they're in negotiations now with several of the Chinese factories to set up in Mexico. And then when I look at Chinese clients, a lot more than I thought are looking to offshore production in order to minimize geopolitics and maybe even costs. So, our law firm does see, I don't deal with these people that often, but our law firm is seeing Chinese companies going to Myanmar, going to Vietnam, in order just to avoid the geopolitical fallout. So I think when we're looking at it, we are seeing a number of relocations at the moment, but they're really not often due to geopolitics. So I think when we're looking at most internationals companies, it's really rare. I don't think I think we haven't seen one who closed down because of this. What we've seen is people will rather shrink or downsize, but very few want to exit. Most of the liquidations that we've done in the last couple of years, they've been retail brands. So it hasn't been people with factories on the ground. And then I think most supply chain diversification happens at the Chinese supplier level. So I think what they're trying to do is slowly diversify. It's not so easy. So when I talk about people, when we're seeing real life relocations, we've got at the moment two. They're both in Kunshan. And this is because of some rezoning that's going on. And it's happening again frequently, I think. The last few years, the governments haven't been that active on this. And then I think in both cases, the client had to really look at, is this the right thing to do? And so in one of the cases, the company is going to downsize its operations, but stay within Kunshan. And then the other company, which has a much bigger operation, they will probably actually close their operations because the Kunshan authorities doesn't want such type of manufacturing in their location. So they wanted to outsource part of the production to another province, and that just doesn't make sense to the client. So I think, if nothing had happened, probably that client would just have stayed, continued their business. But now they're thinking, does it make sense? If we're going to have to close down anyway, does it make sense to rebuild a factory or lease a factory? And then I think when people look at the economic reasons, places like Kunshan or anywhere near Shanghai, production input prices have increased a lot. There's shortages and delays, labor cost increases. In the eastern part of Shanghai, east part of China, we see a lot of labor shortages. And I think, there may be better preferential policies more inland. So there's economic reasons. If you're asked to move, you might say, well, I set up this business 15 years ago. Is it the right size of business now? Maybe I need something bigger. In most cases, the foreign clients have preferred something smaller. So some people are saying, well, all this stuff, does it mean, because some companies like Apple are moving some of their production out, does it really mean the end of the China supply chain? And, happy to, discuss this, because I see on LinkedIn, there's often people who are a bit jaded about China, who really are very excited and think it's the end of the world. I think, this prediction that everybody's going to leave China, they're going to cut out China of the global supply chains, because the reasons that they say is geopolitics makes investing in China much more difficult. COVID has made Western governments realize there's a big danger of being over-reliant on one supplier, especially if there's only one supplier is in China, and that there's this Western consumer backlash due to human rights concerns. So I understand all those arguments, but when I look at our own clients and business, I think I don't think that this is really the case. So the first reason which I'm using here is that very much like Shanghai real estate prices, if you've been in Shanghai or China for 30 or 40 years, you've been hearing about this for 30 years. Everybody said, oh, China's going to be excluded, we're going to do this. So for a long time, we've had predictions. There was an American woman wrote a book about living without China. This is about 10, 15 years ago. It was almost a bestseller then. And I understand now geopolitics has become much sharper, but people thought for a long time China would be replaced. So I don't think that that's likely, because I think China it runs too well, and it is too efficient, and it's just too effective. So the second reason is populism is not easy to implement. So at the moment, I'm talking from London, and so in the last few years, we've seen Brexit. And I think the answers seem very easy. I will leave the European Union, but then when you actually do it, it's very, very complicated. So I think it's easy to say, we've got to cut China out of our supply chain. Yes, but how do you do it? Very complicated. There's, in some products, China has like a 95% plus share of the market. They're embedded in your supply chain. Often China is just part of a wider supply chain. Parts come from Malaysia, Vietnam, assembled in China, and then shipped out. So I think it's not easy. It sounds easy to do, but it can be very complicated. And for that reason, people, once they get into it, get nervous about it. The third reason is what they call the fat smoker. So there was I think he was English. He wrote a book for professional services firms, which is about the fat smoker. And the fat smoker, the problem is everybody knows it's not good to be fat, and everybody knows it's not good to be a smoker, yet there are many fat smokers. And I think if you look at CEOs or management, maybe you think it is good not to have a reliance on China for your supply chain. But do you really want to go through the risk and all the difficulty of changing the supply chain, and it might not work? An example again from the UK, because that's where I am. 2 years ago, Kentucky Fried Chicken changed its logistics provider from DHL to another company. And this was just within the UK, and all it was to transport chicken. So they were just a logistics company. This little change led to Kentucky Fried Chicken for weeks having, everything except for chicken. So consumers were phoning the police complaining that there was no chicken at Kentucky Fried Chicken. And so then they had to go back to the distributor, back to DHL and redo it. So I think, for very few managers, if you've got a safe, secure business, will you be so brave to really jeopardize your whole supply chain just to make the politicians happy? I think human nature is such, that they wouldn't. And then I think, also with the governments, if you look at, the Russian and Ukraine, war at the moment, Russia, I think the only kind of things they export is, oil and gas, which are important. Ukraine has sunflower oil and wheat, but even that conflict has led to large-scale inflation. So if you imagine, if we would take China out of the production cycle, how much inflation would that bring into the system? And so I think you'd have a consumer backlash as well. So for all these reasons, and I'm happy if somebody disagrees, it'd be interesting to hear different viewpoints. I think for all these reasons, there will not be mass dislocation of the supply chain. Maybe in telco or in something which gathers biometric information in sensitive areas, I can see it happening. But for 95% of products, I don't think it's really likely. Daniel, do you have a point on that? Just because otherwise I feel I'm just by myself, It's
Yeah, sure. No, I think it's a good point that you raised. And I do know, particularly for Mexico, whose supply chain is nowhere mature as what China is. I mean, the people are continuing to jump on that train and invest money into there before things are actually working, to kind of just diversify, which makes me feel like, at that particular point, I mean, that's when it would be extremely important to understand things from a legal standpoint. Also, I think local Chinese companies are also doing that in the event where if there's any geopolitical issues that they can say, okay, this is no longer made in China, this is made in Mexico, but it's still Chinese manufacturers directly involved with there in Mexico. I've also heard, I also recently seen something with, heard something very interesting of China, another Chinese company going into the US and investing in a large farm factory. And they purchased like 250 acres out there only to, and had support from the mayor even, only to find out later that they had to call the whole thing off because it was too close to an Air Force facility, and they were only communicated about that later after all this planning and investment. So I think so it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting to see what's going to be going on in the next 2 years or so.
Okay, yeah, good. So I guess they didn't do too much planning if they tried to build it next to an airbase, but yeah. So I guess so I guess it shows those things. So I think there is a big industry of people who left China a bit jaded and they're too excited. Yeah, I'm not saying China's perfect, but for these reasons, I think it's very hard to totally, dislodge yourself. So where are the factories moving to? So I think, most of these kind of things which we're seeing, when they're moving somewhere, I'd say 90% of them probably move within the same zone or locality because that's easier. They might consider to make it a bit smaller. They often might not do construction because I think, for many people, you might get married more than once, but it's very unlikely you want to construct a factory more than once in China. So, it's a very soul-destroying thing to do. And so I think, if you're staying within China, then you have to do the numbers. And some people do move to a cheaper place, and it's only normally if there's an environmental aspect. So because I think the problem is you will lose your staff. If you're in Shanghai, there's no chance of keeping your staff, even if you move somewhere like Changzhou. So I think that's the first kind of question that people ask themselves. And then migrating outside of China, look, I haven't really seen it. So I think, I haven't seen it. Those Japanese companies, we see them closing down and going back to Japan. But I think, mostly the companies will right size, or what's really happening more is if they've got China, they will locate outside of China. It used to be in the past, we would have American manufacturing companies, and they would set up 5 or 6 different production bases within China, which I always thought was a bit, kind of strange instead of consolidating it. But now I think probably they try to establish it somewhere outside of China. So, popular choices by the call tonight, we heard about Thailand a couple of times that some people are joining from Thailand. Vietnam is popular and Mexico is popular as well. So here's just a list of some of them. So you can see, the Japanese ones are mostly, moving into Southeast Asia or back to Japan. And then US, quite a few going to Mexico, and some are trying to go to India. So I think, it would be strange. At the start, people thought everybody would go to Vietnam, but I think that would be then replicating the problem you'd have with China. So you probably also don't want to have all your eggs in the Vietnam basket, especially if there would be some geopolitical, decoupling between West and East. You might find Vietnam to be not much better than China in those regards.
Mark, for Mexico, do you have any information or maybe an introduction on these talks about the Mexican industrial park? This is a question in our chat box.
So what was the question again?
Can you introduce the Mexican industrial park? This is a question from the chat box.
I can, if somebody will send me an email, because it's a client of ours, and I'd have to ask them, because I don't know if their plan is only for their own Chinese suppliers. They're in the textile business, but if somebody's interested, I could make a connection to the client and see if they'd like to discuss it. So yeah, so I'm not at liberty to disclose too much details about the specific project, but it's just an example where an American company that imports a lot from China is trying to bring over 5 of their main Chinese factories, who are kind of competitors very often, to all invest and set up production in Mexico. And one of the reasons for that was if they would try to go cold turkey, it'd be too disruptive, and the Chinese partners, and also they wouldn't know, like to your point, Daniel, could the Mexicans do it quickly and seamlessly? So we have another client who wants to do this, and they're in they're in fast fashion. And one of the main issues in fast fashion, as far as I can tell, as people can no doubt tell from my tie, I'm not very fashionable, but one of the issues is in fast fashion, you have to be able to print the fabric very quickly and at high quality. And even though the American company are the ones who design the different designs, they don't really have the technology to do the printing. So they're trying to have the Chinese supplier set up another production site in, of all places, California, which you'd think is not the easiest place to do production, because of the Chinese know-how. So these are the kind of issues. Excuse me. So I think when we talk about relocations, and so this will be also if you're exiting China, and this is about land compensation. Of course, if you want to sell your site, that's easy. That's just a market decision. If you can find a buyer, that's not an issue. But when we're talking about land compensation, it's a very strange kind of beast. So we've seen compensation, which is where the government takes back the land. There's 2 types. There's a compulsory acquisition, which I've actually never seen. So the Chinese government, the authorities, what I've always seen is they go into a negotiation, they'll negotiate the price, and different compensation, it varies. So the big issues with land compensation is so many people think that everybody who's going to have this kind of land compensation because it's going to be rezoned to residential or commercial, they think it's going to be just a bucket of gold and untold wealth. And I only saw that happen once, and that was 20 years ago, and it was a big American factory in the middle of Hongqiao. So yeah, it was, when it was set up, Hongqiao probably had a few goats and just some mud and some ponds. But this massive factory, when they moved out, probably the Chinese weren't very good at negotiating these things. So those guys got too much money. They made more money with that real estate than they ever did manufacturing in China. So I think people who think that they're going to get a lot of money out of it, they're going to likely be disappointed. But a lot of people make mistakes. So I would get a real estate broker in to support the negotiations, because unless they want to do compulsory acquisition, market value will matter. But some of the problems we've seen is how to determine the value of the land and factory. A lot of people rely on the local staff, and the local staff don't know how to sell a factory or sell a land, and they just agree with the government, and you often get caught. And there will be a valuation, but it's important to have input on the valuation before it gets issued, because the valuation company, once they issue their formal valuation, they can't distance themselves from it. So what we would normally suggest people do is you get a real estate broker to help you on the pricing, the benchmarking, and you review the official appraisal before it gets issued. And that normally really reduces the risk a lot. Another problem is a lot of factories, especially if it's not in Shanghai, if it's somewhere a bit outside, is how do you deal with non-compliant constructions or movable equipment? Shanghai is very tough on these things. So this is not a factory, but a friend of mine owned one of those Chinese old houses, in Shanghai, and he wanted to sell it. But before he could sell it, the Shanghai government said, you have to reinstate it. So, they had another level on top. So they had to take that off and reinstate the building. So, very often, you'll have non-compliant constructions and things like that. Other things which you should think about, the factory shutdown is, you're going to have an operational loss. You have to build up your inventory. how do you measure that? You're going to have to furlough the employees and things like that. And then some clients, if you're in the auto industry or in pharmaceuticals or something, probably your clients are going to have to re-authenticate, or they're going to have to reassess your new factory to license it. And then it will also depend on what you do with the money, whether it's exempt from tax. So if you just get it as a lump sum, then you'll probably be taxed on it if you want to send it offshore. If you use that money to build a new factory, then that's different. There might be limits on the compensation, and what's the right strategy? So I think the right strategy is to make sure that you've got people that understand how these negotiations work. Get the real estate broker to help support you on pricing. Daniel, any comments on this?
Yeah. So we have one question here. Here is have you heard anything about Chinese factory owners moving their operations to Mexico?
Well, only the one which I just mentioned, that's being negotiated. And so I think it's happening not that much in Mexico yet. So I think we see that as an opportunity. But a lot of factories, Chinese factories, have set up in Myanmar and Thailand. So they've been mostly in Southeast Asia, which you can understand, easier for them to get to. But I think they will probably only move to Mexico together with an American partner. And so that American partner, interestingly enough, they wanted to secure their supply chain. So 3 or 4 years ago, they were negotiating to take small shares in those Chinese suppliers. So it shows that there's a kind of symbiotic relationship.
Okay. Excuse me, Mark. Can you talk a little bit more about Myanmar? I've had nightmares in Myanmar since the coup, working with Chinese companies. I have a client that does textile, and they had a couple of companies, a couple factories in Myanmar, and it was their Chinese companies were always on time. They always had great quality. And as soon as they moved to Myanmar, they couldn't deliver, and they ended up going bankrupt. What's your experience there?
Well, I think you got more experience than me, Jay, to be honest. So I think, I don't really have many Chinese clients, but the law firm has a lot. I think what you say wouldn't surprise me, because that's why the supply chain's so difficult to move out. Probably the cheapest place on earth to do, production is probably, I don't know, Syria or something, but there's none of the logistics. You even look at China when it was locked down, the harbor continued to work because they had the closed loop things. So I think, even if you look within China, you might move a factory from Shanghai to Changzhou. Very unlikely you're going to move it to I don't know, Gansu province, because you won't have the same infrastructure for logistics, the same trained employees. So I think Myanmar, and I even think Vietnam probably is Vietnam probably is more developed than Myanmar, but I always thought it was strange to try to do production in Myanmar because it wouldn't have the infrastructure, to do the just-in-time supply. I don't know, that kind of jibes with your experience.
Yeah, the Vietnam factories that I'm dealing with they do not have the expertise in the textile, but they make it up with a big investment in CAD/CAM sewing machines, so they are able to keep the same quality and output, but they have to invest in some much more expensive machines.
Yeah.
On that topic, also, if anyone, India is another question. If there's any, here's if you can speak on any experience with India, and what are they doing to attract companies away from China as well?
Never had good experience with India. So Daniel, do you know what India stands for? Somebody once told me.
What does it stand for?
I'll never do it again. So I think India is a very challenging place. I think, I don't know if it's true, but there was a report that Apple had 94% or something problems with the batches of Indian stuff. So I think, of course, India, can learn stuff and they can do it, and it will be a competitor. But then the question is, for these companies, is it really, do you want to be totally dependent on China for a large part of your supply chain, or do you want to be totally reliant on India? And for that reason, I think probably the smaller Southeast Asian countries might be a better fit, or, reshoring it to the US or to Mexico, I would guess. But, yeah.
Right. And that's interesting, because I know that India is definitely not known for its manufacturing, and many say that if they want to win over China, one of the things they got to figure out is their manufacturing industry as far as their economy goes, which makes me wonder, as far as just incentives and subsidies. I do know Mexico is doing it, and I think I've heard India as well, doing a lot of these subsidies and incentives to try to get foreign corporate talent in there and get the ball rolling for those.
Yeah. Well, I think India's always been good at outsourcing of services. So I think, China's always struggled with outsourcing of services. But I think, India, at least my perception, which might be wrong, is that it probably will need a long time to catch up to China when it comes to manufacturing, is my guess. So, okay, so the next slide, a bit about land compensation. So one issue is people think a bit about always the value, but the other issue, which is very complicated, is when do you get paid the money? So when you're going to move the factory, so this is a relocation rather than just a liquidation, but you're going to have to transfer the current factory, and then you're going to have to buy new land, and people somehow think this will be just seamless, but these are two different government departments, and it's two different cash flows. So this is the issue. So you have to make sure that you get the cash from the people buying the land first before you spend, to buy new land. Local governments in China also have credit squeezes now, so they will always want to pay in installments. But what we've seen is they might be willing to cancel the land certificate, which seems strange. So they'll cancel it earlier, but still allow you to operate for a transitional period. Normally this is a few months, but in one case we saw it was up to 2 years. And so I think with retiming, normally it's after you bid for the new land, you're going to have to pay the land purchase price and relevant taxes pretty quickly, because that's by the law. So you're going to have to make sure you get paid before you bid for the new land. And I would also do due diligence as to pay. So one of our clients is a European company, but it's owned by a large Chinese company, and they have their factory in Minhang. And that company has just refused to leave the site. So the government's been trying to get the land back for like maybe 7 years now, but they always say, we want more money. So I think, it is possible to resist. So if you're not happy with the value, if you're not happy with the payment terms, it's worth, driving a hard bargain sometimes. Okay, so looking for the new location, I guess, this is, again, issues. It's an opportunity to find a newer, cheaper place. Maybe like you were saying, Daniel, about investment agreements with local governments. I think there's a change now in China. A few years ago, it was always, how much tax will you pay? How many employees will you hire? How many trees will you grow? And now I think the local governments, they're quite keen to bring people in. So they're a bit more about subsidies and things like that. Right. And then whether you want to lease or build, I would always try to lease, unless you've got something very fancy. It's better to lease and slightly change it, even if there's a tax consequence, because construction can be very difficult. So I think the other challenges we see are with employees, and for some cases, like that American company, I think they probably were thinking of closing down for a long time, and so this forced land grab by the government actually gives them the opportunity to lay off employees. And some of the questions will be, do you have to change the working hours? if you move within the same kind of region, is it close enough? And then, normally these things, it's actually not so difficult. You just have to get the trade union in line with you, work with government relations. So I think if it's really a relocation, the employees can be a complicated thing, but it's manageable. It's normally if you're just not aware of it being an issue that it blows up. And then I think, business interruption, again, not so dangerous. I think, if many businesses in manufacturing, you're going to need operational licenses. So when you move, almost always these operational licenses are tied to the factory. So you're probably going to have to reapply. And your danger there is really only if you're in the chemical or polluting business. You might need to move further out. So I use the example of Kunshan. We've had quite a few projects there. And in Kunshan, one project we had, a client had a very small paint shop as part of their business, and another client had like a baking oven, to harden the enamel on a type of product. And in both those cases, Kunshan just made it impossible to continue to be in Kunshan. So they actually moved out. So I think if you've got like an environmental impact, or you're very energy consuming, or you have a lot of emissions, or you make a lot of noise, then you have to have a bit of a look at where you are and whether you can stay there. Because if you can't stay there, then you have to have new employees, you have to move to another province and all these things. It's very difficult. And then I think when you look at re-registrations, there's no guidelines for this. So very often the government agencies are not so clear as to what they want to do. So, it's important that you also perhaps guide the process, not just be, following the process.
Now, Mark, I have a question for you. So when the company is beginning to think about relocating factories, I'm assuming, I don't know, for Mexico or India or China, and they try to get into these special zones that provide incentives, or maybe they'll get free land for X amount of years. How does one begin that process and start exploring that type of opportunity?
So I think there, unfortunately, I don't really like lawyers or consultants, but I think probably you would have to deal with a consultant. So in Vietnam, we know some consultants who have relationships with a variety of different parks, and that would be the starting ground. I think, also if we talk about it domestically in China, the mayor of Ningbo was in London this week, and he was very keen to get businesses to invest in Ningbo. So there's a lot of subsidies. So I think a lot of people are very interested in your business, whether it's Ningbo, India or Vietnam or Mexico, but probably you need to get local knowledge in each of those markets. I think, I wouldn't have, the idea of it at the moment. We're probably going to work with the American client to see if other Chinese companies are willing to join their industrial park in Mexico. So if that's an interesting topic for a later day, maybe we can, get him on to explain it to people if there's interest on that topic.
Right. Okay. Sounds good. I do know also sometimes I hear that there are these, independent entities. They call them independent entities, but they're still government related, that that may also actively reach out to prospect factories and say, hey, if you guys move here to this zone, that we'll offer these types of incentives or subsidies. But it always seems like it's like a less proactive thing. It seems like it's almost like a business, for some of these things that we hear, and they'll try to get this, this switch in relocation, and they'll say, we'll also provide you with, X amount of relief, or, maybe, cash subsidy, and they'll do some kind of like percentage share, which always interested me, because they are government related, and it is transparent, but it's kind of like an incentive for these groups to get people to relocate. But I was, part, also for my question for the other for the other side of things, instead of waiting for these people to reach out, what would be the first steps for the company? I remember I saw something with for Chinese companies in regards to, I remember reading something for Chinese companies that were interested in going to the Mexican zone, this Mexican industrial zone, which is supposedly also offering incentives over there in Mexico, and that there was just like this exclusive, Chinese partner or organization that you'd have to reach out to them first to be able to kick off those types of conversations. But if you have any insight or experience with that, or if you heard anything about anything along those lines, that'd be interesting to hear as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be, personally mistrustful of having somebody. If it's just a production for yourself, having a joint venture partner, even if it's a small percentage, that wouldn't normally be in your interests. I was in Germany a few weeks ago. I met a senior ex-politician, and that gentleman, he has a consultancy business, and part of his business is representing a bunch of different zones in China and in India. And he makes those kind of connections. So I think there are these kind of consultants. Of course, you're going to have to make your own assessment. But probably if you're in America, the first thing would be to look for somebody in America who has some of those connections, I would guess. That's...
Got it.
Okay, so the case studies. So these are just like some real life case studies which happened in the last few years. So we had one where the local team of this woofie in Shandong said everything was fully under control. They had the full support of the local government, but was it really? So what we had was, firstly, they said the tax preferential policy was negotiable, but of course it was illegal. The payment term for compensation took forever to negotiate. The risk in construction, so they decided to construct a new factory because that's what the local government wanted to do. That, of course, went over budget, over time. Then there were all these threats, the red-headed letters from the government. And then, we even with the government, you normally think in a place like Shandong, if you negotiate an agreement, it's all okay. But, the honoring and performance was a bit different from the agreement. And then, the other issue was, they negotiated to sell the land and factory, but then when they wanted to buy the new land, which was promised to them, they were told, this new land purchase is not within our jurisdiction. We can't deal with it. And then, also a lack of planning because they didn't think of the bank guarantee for the contractor being required. They didn't have those money. And then, because the thing went on much longer than expected, the local Shandong officers also changed midway. And so I think, there's this old saying, in China is, when you see a problem first, people say, Mei Wenti, so no problem. Then later, there's a problem, and then the local staff will start saying, Wenti Buddha. So there is a problem, but it's not a very big one. And then maybe 6 months later, everybody will say, Mei Bamfa, there's no solution. And they will often query, why did you do the crazy thing which they suggested you do? So I think always in these kind of projects, it can go smoothly, but there's hundreds of little issues. And so if you don't keep things under control and look at things carefully, it's very easy to go sideways because it could go sideways with the sale of the land and building. It could go sideways with tax. It could go sideways with buying new land. It could go sideways with construction, with employees, with customers, with inventory, with operational licenses. So it is a risky thing to do. And so it's important to, make sure that you've got it under control. This one was also a total mess. So it didn't get to be a mess because it was such an insolvable Georgian knot problem that the client just gave up. So what they had was they have a business where about 40% of their global turnover is reliant on one Chinese supplier. And the Chinese supplier owns the tooling and the molds. And they are also the only customer of this Chinese supplier. And so the Chinese supplier during COVID saw the opportunity, of all places, to expand and merge with a company in Wuhan. So he kind of took over a Wuhan company and expanded the production, increased his investment, and just as COVID hit, and then the problem was they didn't need so much of this product either. And so the US client was very worried about the whole thing, but he also wanted to diversify the supply chain. But the problem for him was the Chinese supplier was seeking help from the US company to help him out of this economic hole he dug for himself. And so in the end, the issue was it was inflexible, the relationship. They were codependent. So if the American company would pull the contract, for sure it would kill the Chinese company immediately, but it would also probably kill the American company because they had such a dependency on this. It was difficult or impossible to diversify because the American company couldn't get enough orders to even fulfill the requirements of this new, bigger supplier. Well, it's not new, but how the supplier became bigger, he wasn't able to keep them above water, much less have contracts for a new supplier. And so, you can do due diligence on financial difficulties on the new factory, but what can you do? So in the end, the US company ended up giving financial support. He, ended up paying in advance for product just to keep them alive. So this is the difficult. How do you deal with these kind of issues? It can be very difficult to move away and relocate your supply. So they were the main points, Daniel. So very keen if anybody has any questions or would like to disagree, it'd be even more exciting.
Okay, so this time we will keep the floor open. Does anybody have any questions for Mark on the floor?
Actually, I got a really quick comment on California. Mark was mentioning one of his clients was going to go to California. I've worked with a company that went to California, and they paid for their order, and 9 months later, they were contacted by their American company. They were contacted by the state of California and told that their client went bankrupt and did not pay for their employees' last month or two of salary. And since they were the last order, they were getting sued by the state of California to pay the payroll. So of course that's illegal, but it's more expensive to actually fight that in the state of California than it is to pay the payroll. So they made of course they paid the payroll and said we're never going to do business in the state of California again. California has some very, very liberal socialist policies, and anybody that is investing or doing business there needs to be very cognizant of that.
Okay. Here we have on the chat box, Robert Fish. We're here opening up the floor for some Q&A. All right, so Robert is here. He's left his last question here. Opportunities of U.S. and Chinese cooperating to set up in Mexico. Okay, so this is similar to the previous question that we talked about last time. Anybody else?
I believe Meldy was asking a question about India and some other countries. Meldy, you care to jump in there? Is that how you pronounce your name? Mehdi?
maybe people can't get their microphones off mute. Is that possible?
I've got to ask to unmute on it.
Maybe
hey, I
so.
guess, Charlotte, do you need to unmute people?
Unfortunately, I cannot do that.
Yeah. Okay, well then at this particular time, then maybe we have people just introduce themselves and then also their interest in the discussion. We appreciate everybody who has who's joined this this call or this this presentation, and maybe we'll go through a circle here. We'll start with Ron.
Yeah, hi. I was actually going to ask a question, but my name is Ron Drews. I'm with the World Trade Center of Greater Philadelphia here, working with many companies that are doing international, pretty much all international, and covering things from helping them get into various countries and things related to export finance and being able to structure agreements and such. But I did have a question I wanted to go back while I was to have a chance to ask Mark. Are you seeing a lot of other companies moving to other Southeastern nations such as Indonesia, Malaysia, with their operations, whether it's the factory-related operations or other running their companies with like headquarter offices? And what implications do you see with that?
The only ones we've actually seen personally, I mean, I think, you know, the indication was that most things are moving to Vietnam or Thailand or Mexico. Malaysia, I haven't really seen much. Indonesia, there's been a few large-scale investments when it comes to certain like not rare earths, but the Volkswagen did something which the Shaanxi group. So Indonesia is important from a raw materials and processing perspective. And then that same partner, the Shaanxi group, they've built a 10 square kilometer industrial park for Chinese companies. So, you know, so some of the Chinese companies are trying to also they're a stainless steel manufacturer. So they're trying to bring Chinese companies into Indonesia to service the Southeast Asian market. But I haven't seen much from the foreign companies going there.